My name is Ava, and for the longest time, I believed I had it all. I was the head of marketing at a well-established company with a husband who adored me, Caleb. We had a beautiful house in the suburbs, a place that felt like home every time I walked through the door. We lived comfortably, paying off our mortgage with ease, and I prided myself on managing our finances independently. Our life together was stable, predictable, and comfortable, and most importantly, I thought it was perfect. Family was everything to me. Caleb and I shared a bond that made everything feel like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Caleb had always been close to his family, particularly his mother, Regina, and his younger brother, Felix. I admired the relationship they had, the loyalty, the support, the way they all stuck together after the passing of their father years ago. They were a tight-knit family, and I looked forward to becoming a permanent part of that circle. In the beginning, Regina was warm and welcoming. She was always quick to engage me in conversations at family gatherings, often commenting on my work in marketing, nodding thoughtfully when I explained it. "Marketing, huh? Sounds important," she'd say, and I would smile, proud of how much I had accomplished. It made me feel accepted, like I was part of something larger than myself. The early years of our marriage were blissful. Caleb and I spent weekends together, making memories, visiting friends, attending family dinners, and having spontaneous game nights at Regina's house. One Thanksgiving stands out vividly in my memory. The laughter, the conversation, the warmth, everything about that day made me feel like I truly belonged. The aroma of roasting turkey filled the air, and there was something about Regina's voice when she told stories that made everything feel right. At that moment, I thought I had everything a woman could ever dream of. But that was before things began to change. It was subtle at first, just little things. Small cracks in what I had once considered perfect. I never expected how quickly everything would unravel. It started on a seemingly ordinary New Year's Eve, a night that should have been full of celebration. I had just stepped into the kitchen to refill my wine glass when I overheard Regina talking to Caleb and Felix in the next room. I was used to hearing Regina's soft voice, usually full of warmth, but that night there was something colder in the air. She was making fun of Clara, one of our extended family members, criticizing her affordable dress. "She's trying so hard to fit in with the elites, huh?" Regina mocked, laughing with Caleb and Felix. I paused in the kitchen, the glass in my hand forgotten as I listened. What had once felt like playful teasing now seemed harsh and unkind. My stomach churned. For the first time, I saw a side of Regina I hadn't noticed before. It was subtle, but it stung. Her words were cutting, and she didn't seem to care about the impact they had on Clara. In that moment, something shifted. I began to question everything I had thought I knew about Caleb's family. I stepped out of the kitchen, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. Caleb was at the counter, chatting with Felix about some business venture Felix was starting, while Regina was sitting comfortably on the couch, sipping her wine. Her eyes were narrowed and her lips curved into a sly smile as she watched Clara struggle to keep up with the conversation. It wasn't just the comment about Clara's dress, it was the way Regina had said it, like she had the right to judge someone else's choices. It made my skin crawl. Caleb," I said, walking over to him, my voice a little shaky. He turned to me with a smile as if nothing was amiss. "Hey babe, what's up?" I glanced toward Regina, who was now chatting animatedly with Felix. "I just overheard something, and it didn't sit right with me." Caleb frowned. "What do you mean? You heard something?" I hesitated, not sure how to express the discomfort I felt. It was Regina. She was mocking Clara about her dress, and the way she said it, I shook my head. "It was cruel!" Caleb's face softened for a moment, but then his expression changed. He looked back at Regina, who had just shared another laugh with Felix. I don't know, Ava. You're probably overthinking it. It's just Regina being Regina. I felt a pang in my chest. Overthinking it? I wasn't imagining the way her words had landed, the way they felt like a slap in the face to someone who didn't deserve it. But Caleb! He raised his hand to stop me. Let's just enjoy the night, okay? It's New Year's Eve, Eva. Let's not start something. I wanted to argue, to make him understand how much it hurt, but I didn't. I knew that fighting about this would only make things worse, and I had learned long ago that Caleb didn't like conflict, especially when it involved his family. So I stayed quiet. As time passed, the subtle cruelty of Regina became harder and harder to ignore. It wasn't just the mocking of Clara, it was the constant judgment, the whispered comments about family members, friends, even strangers. It started to feel like Regina and Felix were always in some kind of competition to outdo each other with who could be the most cutting, the most judgmental. And Caleb? He never said a word. One Easter Sunday, after an intense family dinner, I finally reached my breaking point. Regina casually criticized a relative's financial choices, making snide remarks about their decision to buy a modest home. They could have done better, Regina said with a dismissive wave, but I guess that's just how they are. They'll always be stuck in that cycle of mediocrity. I couldn't stay silent anymore. My frustration boiled over, and before I even realized what I was doing, I stood up from the table. Regina, that's not fair, I said, my voice louder than I intended. You can't just talk about people like that. The room went still. Caleb looked at me with wide eyes, Felix's face unreadable. Regina's eyes narrowed, her lips tightening into a thin line. What are you talking about? Regina said, her tone sharp. You've been making these comments for weeks now, I said, feeling my heart race, and I've had enough. It's hurtful, it's cruel. There was a long, tense silence, and I could feel the weight of every set of eyes in the room on me. I turned to Caleb, hoping for his support, but he didn't even look at me. He just stared at the floor as if I wasn't even there. Regina spoke again, her voice cold. Ava, you're overreacting. There's no need to make a scene. My chest tightened. Overreacting? How could she say that? How could Caleb just stand there, silent as his mother tore me down? I turned to him, my frustration spilling out. Caleb, why can't you ever stand up to her? Why is it always me who has to bear the weight of this family's cruelty? Caleb ran a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. She's my mother, Eva. What do you want me to do? I felt like I had been slapped. His words, so dismissive, so empty, cut deeper than anything Regina could have said. I want you to stand by me, to tell her that what she's saying is wrong. I want you to choose me, just for once. But Caleb didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there alone. As the evening wore on, I sat quietly at the table, nursing my drink, trying to keep my emotions in check. I could feel the cold stares from Regina and Felix, the tension in the air, but I no longer cared. I had been trying for so long to keep the peace, to fit into a family that didn't seem to care about me. But now I could feel the truth settling in. I was alone in this. The next few weeks passed in a blur of tension and silent anger. I couldn't shake the image of Caleb's indifference, nor could I ignore the way Regina's words seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken. The hurt wasn't just from that one comment or that single night. It was the accumulation of months, maybe even years, of subtle dismissals and cruelty, all wrapped in a thin veil of family love. I found myself questioning everything, my marriage, my place in the family, and even my own worth. Caleb and I barely spoke at home after the confrontation. There was a thick silence between us, one that no amount of small talk or pleasantries could break. I tried to reach out to ask him what had happened to us, but every time I did, he seemed to withdraw further. He would come home late, too tired to engage in anything meaningful, his mind preoccupied with work or something else I couldn't grasp. One evening, after another quiet dinner, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed answers. I needed to know why Caleb was acting this way, why he was so willing to let me suffer in silence. "Caleb, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid of breaking the fragile silence that had settled between us. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at the TV, flipping channels absently, as if I hadn't spoken at all. I felt my frustration grow, tightening in my chest, until it felt like I might explode. "Caleb!" I snapped, louder this time. He turned slowly to face me, his eyes tired, his face weary. "What is it, Ava?" he asked, his voice low and distant. "You've been so distant lately," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "You've barely talked to me. I feel like I'm living with a stranger. What's going on? Why aren't you standing by me?" His face softened for a moment, but then the coldness returned. "Ava, I'm just tired. Work has been exhausting, and honestly, I don't know how to fix this. You've been pushing me away too. I'm trying, but I can't fix everything." I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You think I'm pushing you away?" I asked, my voice shaking with disbelief. "How could you say that? You're the one who's been absent. You're the one who's been ignoring me, avoiding me. How can you say that it's my fault?" He stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth in the living room. "I don't know what you want from me, Ava. I've been trying, okay? But it's not easy when you keep attacking my family." "Attacking your family?" I repeated, my voice rising. "I'm not attacking anyone. I'm just trying to survive in a family that doesn't seem to care about me, that doesn't seem to care about us. And don't pretend like you haven't noticed the way your mother treats me. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine, Caleb." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his face a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. "You don't get it, do you? Regina is my mother. I've been living with her my entire life, and I don't have the energy to keep fighting her. I can't do it, Ava. I just can't." His words hit me like a slap to the face. I felt my heart shatter in an instant. "So you're choosing her over me?" I asked quietly, the tears threatening to spill over. "You're choosing her over our marriage?" He didn't answer right away. The silence between us was thick, suffocating. Then he said something that made my stomach twist in knots. "Maybe I'm not the one who's choosing, Eva," he said, his voice cold. "Maybe you're the one who's pushing me away." I felt my knees weaken and I sat down on the couch, unable to process what he had just said. "I've been nothing but supportive, Caleb," I whispered. "I've done everything for this family, for you, and this is what I get in return?" He didn't respond, and that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a bad patch in our marriage. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a few kind words or a change in routine. This was something deeper, something that had been festering for years. I had married a man who was incapable of standing up for me, who was so entrenched in his family's dynamics that he couldn't see how much I was hurting. The pain of that realization was unbearable. I had never felt so alone in my life, and it wasn't just the emotional neglect from Caleb that cut me deep. It was the realization that I had been living in a relationship where my needs, my feelings, didn't matter. Where I was just expected to play my part, to fit into a family that didn't care about me. The days after that conversation were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, the weight of Caleb's words. I tried to talk to him again, but he was always too busy or too tired, and every time I reached out, I felt more and more invisible. Then, one day, as I was sitting in the living room, nursing a cup of tea, I got a call from my doctor. I had been feeling unwell for weeks, nauseous, dizzy, and exhausted, and I hadn't been able to get a proper diagnosis. The call confirmed that I was pregnant with our second child. At first, the news didn't sink in. I held the phone to my ear, hearing the doctor's voice, but all I could think about was the state of my marriage. Caleb and I were already on the brink, and now, with a baby on the way, things were about to get even more complicated. I called Caleb at work, my heart racing as I tried to find the right words. When he answered, his voice sounded distracted. "Hey, what's up?" "I'm pregnant," I said, barely able to get the words out. There was a long pause, and then Caleb spoke, his voice oddly distant. "Oh, that's great, Eva. We'll talk about it when I get home." But even before the conversation ended, I could tell. His reaction wasn't one of excitement or joy, it was just another moment of indifference, another sign that he was no longer invested in our life together. Days turned into weeks, and the gap between Caleb and me grew wider. I tried to be optimistic about the pregnancy, hoping that this new life would be the bridge that brought us back together. But the more I tried to focus on the baby, the more I realized that nothing was going to change. Caleb continued to stay away, both emotionally and physically. He came home late, barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was always about his work or some trivial thing that didn't matter. And then came the night of my scheduled C-section. I was lying on the operating table, nerves coursing through me as I waited for the doctors to begin. I asked for Caleb, but when the nurse went to find him, she returned with a look of confusion. "He's chosen to wait outside, Mrs. Eva." The surgery went smoothly, and hearing our baby's first cries was a moment I would never forget. It was supposed to be a joyful moment, a moment of connection and love. But when Caleb finally entered the recovery room, all I saw on his face was discomfort and annoyance. "This isn't right," he said, his voice strained. "Why did you need a C-section? It's not even necessary." I stared at him, shocked and hurt by his words. "Caleb, I almost died giving birth to our child. How can you be so cold about this?" But he didn't respond. He stormed out of the room, leaving me alone to recover from a life-threatening surgery, physically and emotionally exhausted. That was when I knew our marriage was beyond saving. Caleb was no longer the man I had married. He was someone I didn't recognize, someone who couldn't see beyond his own needs and couldn't even show up for his family. A few weeks later, I made the hardest decision of my life. I filed for divorce. I couldn't stay in a marriage where I wasn't loved, where my worth wasn't recognized. I couldn't continue living in a family that didn't care about me. And I couldn't raise my children in an environment where love was conditional and support was absent. The process was brutal. Caleb didn't contest much, and the judge awarded me the house, citing that I had been the one paying the mortgage for years. Caleb took his things and left, sneering at me as he walked out the door. But as I stood in the doorway, watching him leave, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The house that had once felt so cold now felt warm. It was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. A year later, life had settled into a new rhythm. I had returned to work, finding a balance between my career and motherhood. My boys and I were happy, healthy, thriving. And then, one ordinary Tuesday, I saw the news. Caleb, Felix, and Regina had lost everything. It turned out that Sarafina, Felix's wife, had been running an elaborate scam, convincing them to invest in a fake financial venture. They had taken out massive loans, mortgaged Regina's house, and lost everything. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of vindication. It was a bitter irony, knowing that I had left just in time to avoid the devastation that followed. And though it wasn't the way I would have wanted things to end, it was a reminder that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save us. The days following the conversation with Caleb were a blur. Every time I woke up in the morning, it felt like I was walking through a fog, unsure of what I would face next. Caleb was distant, colder than he had ever been. It wasn't just the silence, it was the emotional withdrawal, the absence of any support from him. I had hoped that the pregnancy would somehow pull us together, that this new life growing inside me would be the spark to reignite our bond. But the reality was far from what I had imagined. Caleb seemed to pull further away with each passing day, and the more I needed him, the more he became an elusive shadow. I had been feeling nauseous for weeks, unable to shake the constant dizziness and weakness. I tried to push through it at first, but it wasn't long before I realized that something was wrong. I couldn't keep my balance, my vision started to blur, and I had frequent headaches that made it difficult to concentrate at work. It wasn't just the normal discomfort of pregnancy, it was something more serious. I had been to the doctor a few times, but the news I received on that final visit changed everything. I had a condition that could jeopardize my pregnancy, a complication that would require me to be on bed rest for the next few months. The news hit me hard. I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with a sense of fear. I was scared for the baby, scared for myself, and scared for the future. I needed Caleb more than ever, but instead of comforting me, he seemed to retreat further into himself. He came home later each night, his mind always elsewhere. When he was home, he would mumble a few words before retreating into the other room. The only time he seemed remotely engaged was when he talked about his work, his brother Felix's latest business ventures, or some other trivial detail. But when it came to me, when it came to us, I felt like I was invisible. It was hard to be excited about the pregnancy when the person I needed most was never there. Caleb's reaction when I told him about the pregnancy had been lukewarm at best. There was no joy, no excitement. He barely even acknowledged the gravity of the situation, brushing it off with a few hurried words before moving on to something else. "That's great, Eva. We'll talk about it later," he had said, as though I were telling him I had bought a new pair of shoes. There was no warmth, no tenderness, just indifference. The isolation I felt was suffocating. I began to stay in bed more, trying to rest and heal, but the loneliness in our home was unbearable. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. Every time I tried to talk to Caleb, he shut me out. Every time I reached out for comfort, he was too exhausted or too preoccupied with something else to offer any solace. I couldn't understand what had happened to us. How had we gone from being so close to this? How had Caleb, the man I once believed in, become someone who could stand by and watch me suffer in silence? One day I reached my breaking point. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that our marriage was just going through a rough patch. The truth was too loud to ignore. I needed to confront him, to understand why he had changed, to understand what had happened to the man I had married. I waited for him to come home from work that evening, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air between us like a storm cloud. When he walked through the door, I was sitting on the couch, trying to gather my thoughts. His face was tired, his eyes dull from the long hours at work. He barely glanced at me as he kicked off his shoes and headed for the kitchen. "Caleb," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. "We need to talk." He paused for a moment, then turned slowly to face me. "What now, Eva?" he asked, his tone flat, almost bored. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my heart racing. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. You've been so distant, so cold. I don't even know who you are anymore." Caleb sighed and leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm just tired, okay? I'm working all the time, and when I get home, I don't want to fight. I don't want to deal with your stress on top of everything else." I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I fought them back. I'm not asking for you to solve everything, Caleb. I'm not asking for you to be perfect. I'm asking for you to be here, for you to care. I'm carrying our child, and I feel like I'm doing this alone. You're here physically, but you're not really here. You haven't been for weeks. He shook his head, his frustration evident. Ava, I don't need this right now. You're making this about you. But we both know that this pregnancy isn't the only issue here. You've been pushing me away too. I stared at him in disbelief. I've been pushing you away. How can you say that? You've been the one who shut me out. I've been asking for your support and you've given me nothing. You haven't been there for me, not in any way that counts. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing, and for a brief moment I saw a flash of something in his face, something that looked like anger, or perhaps guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He turned away from me and walked toward the kitchen without another word. I sat there in silence, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. I had never felt more alone in my life. Caleb's indifference cut deeper than any sharp words ever could. He was my partner, the person I had trusted with everything, and now I was left with nothing but emptiness. Over the next few days, things only worsened. Caleb continued to come home late, spending more and more time at work or with his family. Every time I tried to talk to him, he brushed me off with excuses, his patience worn thin. I could feel the distance growing between us, like a chasm that no amount of words could bridge. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. I found out that my vision had begun to deteriorate due to the complications with my pregnancy. It was a rare condition, one that required immediate attention. I had to stop working and focus solely on my health, which meant relying on Caleb even more. But instead of stepping up, Caleb pulled further away. His behavior became even more erratic, and his disregard for me and the baby grew more apparent every day. I was alone in this, completely alone. I had never felt so abandoned in my entire life. The breaking point came when I went into labor unexpectedly early. My water broke while I was sitting on the couch, and the pain hit me like a wave, crashing over me, sending me into a panic. I dialed Caleb's number, but he didn't pick up. I called again, desperation rising in my chest. Finally, he answered. "What's going on, Ava?" he asked, sounding distracted as if he were in the middle of something. "My water broke," I screamed. "I need you, please. I need you here now." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he finally spoke. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice distant. But when he arrived, it was clear that his mind was somewhere else. He barely acknowledged my pain, his face twisted in frustration. "Why are you so dramatic, Eva?" he muttered under his breath. "It's just a baby. Calm down." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. In that moment, I realized that I was not only physically alone in my labor, I was emotionally alone too. Caleb wasn't the man I thought he was. He wasn't the partner I had hoped for. He wasn't even the man I had married. I gave birth to our child that day, but the joy of the moment was overshadowed by the harsh reality of our relationship. As I held our newborn son in my arms, I felt nothing but sadness. I had always believed that a child could bring a couple closer together, but this wasn't the case for us. Caleb was distant, cold, and uninterested, and I had no choice but to accept that our marriage was over. In the days that followed, I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep living this way, in a marriage where I was emotionally abandoned and neglected. I couldn't raise my children in an environment that was so toxic. I filed for divorce, and though it was the hardest decision I had ever made, it was the only one left. The process was long and painful, but eventually the judge ruled in my favor. I received the house, Caleb left, and I started rebuilding my life, step by step. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I was free. It wasn't until months later, when I learned of Caleb's financial ruin, that I realized how lucky I was to have gotten out when I did. He had lost everything: his money, his investments, and his family's trust. Serafina, the woman he had trusted, turned out to be a fraud. I didn't feel satisfaction in his downfall, but I did feel a deep sense of relief. I had escaped just in time. As I moved forward with my life, I knew that the pain would always linger, but I also knew that I had made the right choice. My children and I were safe, and I had found a new strength within myself that I never knew existed. The days following the birth of our son felt like a blur of exhaustion and emotional numbness. I had hoped that after the baby arrived, things might improve, that Caleb would somehow snap out of his distant, cold demeanor. But as the days went by, it became increasingly clear that nothing would change. Caleb was still emotionally absent, and I found myself navigating the challenges of new motherhood without his support. The first few nights in the hospital were especially hard. The pain from my C-section was unbearable, and the exhaustion of labor mixed with the overwhelming task of caring for a newborn left me physically and emotionally drained. But through it all, I never stopped hoping that Caleb would come around. Maybe it was because I had always believed in the person I had married, the man I thought would be there for me no matter what. But instead of stepping up, Caleb continued to withdraw. He barely visited me in the hospital, choosing instead to stay at home, away from the chaos. When he finally did show up, his discomfort was palpable. He barely glanced at our son, his face tight with annoyance. He seemed more irritated by the situation than anything else. "Ava," he said as he walked into my recovery room, his voice cold. "This is all wrong. I didn't sign up for this. The whole hospital thing, it's just too much." I stared at him, my heart sinking with each word he spoke. "What do you mean, Caleb?" I asked, my voice small. "This is our son. This is supposed to be a moment we share together." But he didn't seem to understand. He looked away, rubbing the back of his neck as if he were trying to escape the reality of what was happening. "I just can't do this," he muttered, looking at the floor. "I don't want to be here, Ava. This isn't the way I imagined things." The words stung like a slap in the face. I wanted to scream, to tell him how selfish he was being, but all I could do was lie there, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I had just given birth. My body was recovering from major surgery, and Caleb couldn't even be bothered to support me. How had we gone from being a team, a partnership, to this? As I lay in that sterile hospital bed, surrounded by machines and the faint beeping of monitors, I realized the truth. My marriage was over. It had been over for a long time, but I had refused to see it. The man I had married, the man I had trusted, was gone, and in his place was a stranger who didn't care about me, who didn't care about our family. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, nursing sessions, and endless doctor's appointments. I was physically drained, but emotionally I was numb. Caleb barely helped with the baby. He would occasionally make a passing comment when the baby cried, but it was always something dismissive like, "Can you get him to shut up?" Or, "Why does he keep crying?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was still recovering from a major surgery, and Caleb couldn't even be bothered to step in and help. It wasn't just the lack of help, it was the complete lack of compassion. He didn't seem to care that I was struggling, that I was alone in this. Every day I would ask for help, and every day he would brush me off. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I found myself sitting on the couch, holding our baby in my arms as I tried to calm him down. Caleb was on the other side of the room, scrolling through his phone, completely oblivious to what was happening. The baby's cries grew louder, and I felt my patience start to snap. I was physically and mentally exhausted, and I couldn't do it alone anymore. "Caleb," I said, my voice shaking with frustration, "can you please help me? He's teething and I don't know what to do." He looked at me, his eyes glazed over as if he hadn't heard a word I said. "I'm busy, Ava," he said flatly. "You handle it. I need some time to myself." I was stunned. "Time to yourself? Caleb, I'm here with the baby every single day, alone. I need you here with me. I can't do this by myself." But he didn't even seem to hear me. He turned back to his phone, his eyes glued to the screen, completely disengaged from the reality of what was happening around him. I sat there holding the baby, feeling a wave of hopelessness wash over me. This wasn't the life I had imagined. This wasn't the family I had dreamed of. And as I looked at Caleb, sitting there completely detached, I realized that it wasn't just our marriage that was falling apart. It was everything. The next morning, I woke up to find that Caleb had already left for work. He hadn't said goodbye, hadn't even checked on me or the baby. It was like he had completely checked out of our lives. And that was when I made the decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it was falling apart. I needed to take control of my life, to take back my power. I knew that I couldn't change Caleb, that I couldn't fix our marriage, but I could change my own future. I filed for divorce the next day. The process was brutal. Caleb didn't fight me on it, but that didn't make it any easier. The emotional toll was immense. Every time we had to meet to discuss the terms of the divorce, I could feel the anger and resentment building between us. But through it all, I knew I was doing the right thing. I was walking away from a marriage that had drained me, that had made me feel invisible and unimportant. I was finally choosing myself. I won full custody of the kids, and the judge awarded me the house. Caleb left, taking only his clothes and a few personal items, but he didn't seem to care. He didn't even fight for the house or the kids. It was like he had already checked out, and in a way, I was relieved. I didn't want him around anymore, not after everything he had put me through. The first few months after the divorce were hard. I was adjusting to life on my own, learning how to navigate motherhood without Caleb's help. But as time went on, I began to find my footing. I went back to work, started making new friends, and slowly started to rebuild my life. The house, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a sanctuary. It was mine. I had earned it. I had fought for it. And then one day I found out about Caleb's downfall. I was scrolling through my phone when I saw a news article about a local financial scandal. The article detailed how Serafina, Felix's wife, had swindled Caleb, Felix, and Regina into investing in a fake financial scheme. They had lost everything: money, property, their savings. It turned out that Caleb had put all his trust in Serafina, only to be betrayed. I can't say I felt bad for him. Part of me, deep down, felt a sense of vindication. The man who had abandoned me, who had pushed me to the brink of despair, was now suffering the consequences of his own poor decisions. He had lost everything, and I had gained everything by walking away. But it wasn't just about that. It was about the freedom I had found, the strength I had discovered within myself. I was no longer the woman who had been afraid to stand up for herself. I was no longer the woman who had depended on Caleb to make her feel whole. I was independent and I was free. As I looked at my children who were growing up strong and happy, I realized that everything I had gone through had been worth it. It had been painful, it had been hard, but in the end I had emerged stronger than I ever thought possible. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece. The divorce was finalized, and I had the house to myself and my boys. At first, the silence was overwhelming. It was as if I had lived so long in a state of constant tension and noise that now, in the quiet aftermath, I didn't know what to do with myself. The first few nights alone were the hardest. I had grown so accustomed to Caleb's presence, his indifference, his avoidance. Now, without him, I had to navigate a new reality, one where I was entirely responsible for everything, but also for the first time in years, free. I didn't know where to start. The emotional weight of the past few years had left scars that I wasn't sure I could heal, but I knew I had to try. My children needed me to be strong. They needed me to be there for them, to show them that even in the face of hardship, we could rise above it. And so I threw myself into mothering, into my work, into rebuilding the sense of self that I had lost over the years. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like giving up, like the weight of everything was too much to bear. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I realized that the life I had dreamed of, the happiness I had yearned for, was possible, even without Caleb. I started seeing a therapist, something I had never considered before. Talking about my feelings, my anger, my disappointment, it was exhausting but cathartic. It helped me understand that I wasn't the problem. I wasn't the one who had caused the pain in our marriage. It had been Caleb's inability to see me, to truly hear me, that had driven us apart. And as much as it hurt to admit it, he had never really been the partner I thought he was. I had been living in a dream, one where I thought love was enough to fix everything, but it wasn't. Love wasn't enough if it wasn't mutual, if it wasn't backed by respect, support, and understanding. But therapy wasn't the only thing that helped me heal. Slowly, I began to reconnect with friends I had lost touch with during the years of my marriage. They were there for me when I needed them most, offering support, advice, and unconditional love. They reminded me of who I was before all of this began, before I became someone who was willing to lose herself for the sake of a relationship that wasn't healthy. I started to rediscover passions I had forgotten about, things that had been pushed aside in the chaos of my marriage. I took up yoga, something I had always wanted to try, and found that the physical activity helped clear my mind. I started reading again, something I hadn't done in years, and found solace in the pages of books that transported me to other worlds. At work, I thrived. My boss recognized the hard work I had been putting in, and I began to climb the corporate ladder faster than I had ever anticipated. I was making decisions that impacted the company, feeling empowered in ways I never had before. It was liberating to be in control of my own life, to know that I didn't have to depend on anyone, especially not Caleb. The promotion came as a surprise, but in hindsight, I saw it as a natural progression. I had been working hard for years, but now I was doing it for myself. The money, the recognition, it wasn't as important as the sense of accomplishment I felt in knowing that I had done it alone, that I had proven to myself that I could achieve anything. But even as I began to heal, there were moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I had made the right decision by leaving Caleb. There were times when I missed the idea of our family, the dream of what we could have been. It was hard not to look back and wonder, what if things had been different? What if Caleb had changed, had chosen me, had been the man I needed him to be? One day, as I sat in my living room, reflecting on how far I had come, my phone buzzed. I looked down and saw Caleb's name on the screen. My heart skipped a beat. It had been months since I had heard from him. I hadn't thought about him much, but seeing his name, it stirred something deep inside me. I hesitated before picking up the phone, unsure of what he wanted. Eva, his voice came through the phone, low and hesitant. I need to talk to you. I paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. What is it, Caleb? I finally asked, my voice steady but guarded. There was a long silence on the other end. I messed up, he finally admitted. I know I've hurt you. I know I've failed you. I don't know where to start. I felt a rush of anger surge through me, but I took a deep breath. Caleb, you had every opportunity to fix this. I gave you chances and you chose to ignore me. You chose your family over me. I'm done. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with regret. I've lost everything, my family, my money, my sense of purpose. I don't know who I am anymore. I've realized too late what I had and now it's gone. I was silent for a moment, processing his words, but even as the anger started to fade, a sense of relief washed over me. I had made the right decision. I had chosen myself, and I had built a life without him. I didn't need him anymore. You had your chance, Caleb, I said, my voice firm but calm. I've moved on, I've found my strength, and I'm not going back. He was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. I understand, I wanted to say I'm sorry, Ava. I felt nothing, no sadness, no anger, just a quiet acceptance. Goodbye, Caleb, I said softly before hanging up the phone. It was over, for good this time. And as I sat there, holding my son in my arms, I realized that I had done the right thing. I had taken control of my life, rebuilt myself from the ground up, and I had come out stronger than I ever thought possible. I had broken free from the chains of a toxic relationship, and now I was free to live the life I deserved. My children and I were happy, healthy, thriving. We had created a new family, one built on love, trust, and mutual respect. The journey had been long and at times painful, but in the end I had found my peace, and as I looked to the future, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. I had survived the storm, and now it was time to live. It was time to embrace the freedom I had fought for, to show my children that no matter how many times life knocked us down, we could always rise again. We could always find a way to start over. As I watched my children play in the yard, laughing and running free, I realized that the best was yet to come. The pain of the past was behind me, and the future was filled with endless possibilities. I was no longer afraid. I was finally free. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more emotional, real-life tales, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join our community and stay tuned for future stories that will inspire, touch your heart, and remind you that no matter what life throws your way, you're never alone. Subscribe now and be part of this journey with us. We have so much more to share. Thanks for being here, and see you in the next story.